In the aftermath of the Great War of 2077, when the skies of Earth turned to ash and the silence of annihilation spread across the continents, the region once known as the Commonwealth of Massachusetts descended into a chaos unlike any other part of post-war America, its transformation from a cradle of innovation into a fractured wasteland, marking one of the most sobering examples of civilization's fragility and resilience alike. For centuries before the bombs fell, the Commonwealth had been a hub of technological progress and academic prowess, the home of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, later known simply as the Institute, whose influence on pre-war science and robotics had made the region one of the most advanced on the planet, but also one of the most morally precarious, where the pursuit of knowledge often outpaced the restraint of conscience. When the nuclear fire swept through Boston and its surrounding towns, the devastation obliterated not only infrastructure, but the psychological backbone of the survivors, who stumbled from the ruins of their homes into a new world defined by hunger, fear, and uncertainty. The early years after the Great War were a dark age, where the concept of community itself became a luxury. Those who survived did so by scavenging among the ruins, banding together in loose groups, or turning to raiding and murder as a means of survival. The Commonwealth's proximity to major pre-war industrial and scientific centers meant that its post-war inhabitants were surrounded by relics of immense potential: fusion cores, robotics facilities, and weapons caches, but lacked the societal framework to wield them responsibly. Raiders, mercenaries, and mutated horrors such as feral ghouls and super mutants began to roam the land unchecked, preying upon the weak and further eroding any hope of collective recovery. Over the first 2 centuries following the war, small enclaves of survivors managed to re-establish a semblance of civilization in the form of settlements, often built upon the ruins of pre-war neighborhoods like Sanctuary Hills, Ten Pines Bluff, and the outskirts of Concord. These early settlements, while courageous in their defiance of the wasteland's cruelty, were perpetually under siege, not from foreign armies or ideological adversaries, but from the simple, relentless lawlessness that pervaded every mile of the region. It is within this crucible of desperation that the conditions for the eventual birth of the Commonwealth Minutemen were forged. The name Commonwealth itself, though officially denoting the pre-war state of Massachusetts, took on a new and bitter irony. Once a term that implied shared wealth and governance by the people, it now represented a landscape of scarcity and division. In the early 2200s and well into the 23rd century, no central authority existed to govern the region. The major power blocks that had begun to arise elsewhere, the new California Republic in the west, the Brotherhood of Steel across various territories, and the remnants of the enclave skulking in shadows, were distant legends to most of the Commonwealth's inhabitants. Here, survival was local, immediate, and personal. Settlements relied on whatever defense they could muster: makeshift barricades, armed scavengers, or mercenaries who would protect a village for a few days before moving on. Trust was scarce, trade dangerous, and every stranger potentially hostile. In this void of law and unity, the idea of collective defense, of neighbors coming together to protect one another rather than prey upon each other, was both revolutionary and nostalgic. It evoked the myths of the old world, particularly of the American Revolution, whose echoes still haunted the ruins of Boston through its monuments and battlefields. The surviving citizens, some of whom were the descendants of pre-war patriots, or had grown up hearing tales of the original Minutemen of the 18th century, found in that symbolism a thread of meaning amid the chaos. Thus, the conceptual seed of the modern Commonwealth Minutemen was not merely a military one, it was spiritual, born from a longing to believe that ordinary people could once again stand for something greater than themselves. Before the Minutemen as an organization would exist, there were smaller, uncoordinated militias, settlement guards, and neighborhood defense bands, operating independently, often with varying degrees of morality or discipline. In places like Lexington, Concord, and Sanctuary Hills, farmers and scavengers armed themselves with whatever they could salvage: pipe pistols, jury-rigged laser muskets, or even pre-war hunting rifles passed down through generations. Many of these groups failed, their members killed or scattered by better armed raiders or mutant incursions, yet a few endured. And from their endurance came the first whispers of unity. Oral tradition suggests that the earliest efforts to create inter-settlement defense pacts began around the mid-23 RD century, when several communities recognized that their isolation made them easy targets. Raiders, often numbering in the hundreds and organized under brutal warlords, were capable of wiping out entire towns in a single night. Survivors of such attacks would flee to neighboring settlements, bringing with them tales of horror that transcended any single community's experience. This shared trauma became the foundation of collective resolve. People began to remember that before the bombs, Massachusetts had been a birthplace of rebellion against tyranny. The parallels between their plight and that of the early American colonists were not lost on them. Slowly, the language of resistance began to shift. Raider warlords became the new redcoats, while those who fought to defend their homes were spoken of as Minutemen, the old world term for citizen soldiers ready to fight at a moment's notice. The early Commonwealth was thus a landscape where myth and necessity intertwined. The monuments of the Old World still stood in shattered silhouettes: the Old North Church, the Bunker Hill Memorial, and the cracked bronze of Paul Revere, reminders of a time when courage and unity had once triumphed over chaos. In this environment, the invocation of the Minutemen's legacy carried both symbolic and psychological power. For many settlers, the idea of reviving such a tradition was not merely about defense, it was about reclaiming identity, asserting that they were still a people with history, not just survivors of catastrophe. The rebirth of civilization in the Commonwealth was not guided by grand ideologies or sweeping institutions, but by scattered acts of courage and cooperation. Farmers who shared their harvests, engineers who restored pre-war technology, and caravan traders who risked their lives to connect settlements, all contributed to a growing sense that unity was possible. By the time the first century after the war had turned into the second, the people of the Commonwealth had learned one immutable truth: that no one settlement could stand alone for long. This understanding, though born of tragedy, was the philosophical foundation of what would become the Minutemen. The belief that strength came not from power, but from solidarity. Still, the road from shared ideals to organized defense was neither simple nor immediate. The Commonwealth was riddled with competing interests and emerging threats. Raiders remained a constant scourge, while the growing presence of supermutants, descendants of the Master's experiments that had spread eastward, added a new dimension of terror. Bands of ghouls roamed the ruins, their numbers swelling in irradiated zones, and the enigmatic synths androids created by the Institute beneath the earth introduced paranoia and distrust into the hearts of the people. Who could one trust when even a neighbor might be an artificial imposter? In such conditions, cooperation was both necessary and fraught with suspicion. Yet even as the world grew darker, scattered settlements began to communicate again, using traders and couriers as their lifelines. These fragile networks laid the groundwork for the idea of coordinated defense, of calling for aid when under siege. And though history does not record the names of those first few who conceived it, somewhere in the ruins of old Concord and its surrounding towns, the vision of the Commonwealth Minutemen began to take shape. To understand the birth of the Minutemen, one must also understand the psychological rebirth of the survivors themselves. The early generations who emerged from the ashes were, for all intents and purposes, feral in their priorities, driven by hunger, fear, and instinct. But as the decades passed, and new generations were born into the wasteland, the trauma of the Great War began to lose its immediacy. People began to dream again, to look beyond mere survival. Children born after the bombs grew up without memory of the old world, and thus without its guilt or attachments. For them, the Commonwealth was not something lost, it was all they had ever known, and therefore something that could still be built. It is within this generational shift that the seeds of hope germinated. The Minutemen would later be described as protectors of the people, but their earliest identity was that of builders, individuals who refused to surrender to the void. In this sense, the birth of the Commonwealth Minutemen can be seen not as the creation of an army, but as the awakening of a culture, a rediscovery of humanity's oldest instinct, to stand together against the darkness. By the late 23rd century, the Commonwealth had become a patchwork of fortified settlements linked by tenuous trade routes and shared danger. The descendants of those first survivors were now farmers, engineers, and traders who understood that the raiders' strength lay in their ability to strike unpredictably. The settlements began experimenting with signal systems, smoke beacons, flares, and improvised radio transmissions to call for help in times of crisis. Though primitive, these systems represented the embryo of what would later become the Minutemen's famous call-to-arms network, a decentralized method of mutual defense. Oral accounts and fragmented holotape records suggest that this movement gained symbolic momentum in the town of Concord, a name that had once stood for unity and cooperation even before the war. Here, a coalition of settlement leaders gathered to discuss the formalization of a defense pact, one that would transcend individual settlements and create a standing militia of volunteers. It is impossible to know the exact date of this meeting, but its consequences would ripple across the entire Commonwealth for centuries to come. For the first time since the bombs fell, ordinary people began to think collectively again, not in terms of survival alone, but in terms of rebuilding civilization. Thus, the birth of the Commonwealth Minutemen was not marked by a single battle or founding ceremony, but by a gradual awakening, a series of choices made by countless unnamed individuals who chose cooperation over isolation. The Commonwealth that emerged from their efforts was still dangerous, still broken, but no longer hopeless. From the ashes of the Great War, amid ruins haunted by ghosts of both the old world and its ambitions, a new ideal was born, that even in the face of annihilation, ordinary people could become extraordinary when united by purpose. And though the decades ahead would bring both triumph and tragedy, betrayal and rebirth, the spirit that gave rise to the Minutemen, the belief that the people themselves were the only true guardians of the Commonwealth, would endure, echoing through the centuries like the faint toll of a liberty bell buried beneath the dust of history. When the scattered survivors of the Commonwealth began to rebuild their fractured existence amid the ruins of the old world, they were surrounded by ghosts, remnants of the pre-war civilization whose monuments still jutted from the broken earth like bones of a dead giant, reminding the living of both the grandeur and folly of the age that came before. Nowhere else in post-war America did history weigh so heavily upon the present. Every cracked statue and toppled steeple seemed to whisper lessons from a time when the people of Massachusetts had once fought for liberty against tyranny, only to later destroy themselves in a war of pride and power. It was in this haunting landscape that the survivors found not only shelter among the ruins, but meaning in the echoes that surrounded them. The Commonwealth was unique among the wastelands, in that its physical remnants of history, Boston Common, the Old North Church, Bunker Hill, and the Freedom Trail, remained remarkably intact compared to other regions, as if history itself refused to die here. The colonists of old had once declared that the shot heard round the world was fired in Concord, Massachusetts, signaling the birth of the American Revolution. Centuries later, in the same shattered soil, the first shots of a new kind of revolution, one for survival, would be fired by those who called themselves the Minutemen. But before they came together as an organized force, the people of the Commonwealth would first have to rediscover what it meant to stand for something larger than survival itself, and in doing so, they would draw upon the forgotten ideals and imagery of the old world to fill the void left by the collapse of modern governance. When the bombs fell, they did more than level cities. They annihilated the continuity of institutions, erasing every structure that once gave ordinary citizens a sense of belonging. The survivors who emerged from vaults or scavenged from the ashes were left not only homeless but historyless, unmoored from any collective identity. Yet among the rubble of the Commonwealth, history could not be fully erased. The past was literally carved into the stones beneath their feet, engraved in memorials and preserved in the ruins of schools, libraries, and museums that had survived the blast. Even illiterate scavengers could recognize the symbolic power of these relics. A tattered flag fluttering above a crumbling courthouse could still stir something ancient in the human soul, a memory of defiance, unity, and hope. The mythology of the American Revolution, dormant for centuries, began to resurface among the people as they searched for meaning in their shattered world. The names of places like Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill were not just coordinates on a map. They were sacred words from a mythic past that spoke of courage and sacrifice. The survivors began to tell stories, passing them from one generation to the next, about the men and women who had once risen up against impossible odds to overthrow oppression. In the absence of formal education or organized religion, these stories became the oral scripture of the wasteland, a shared heritage that bound people together through narrative. Children raised among the ruins would play games pretending to be Minutemen, wielding sticks as muskets, and reenacting imaginary battles against unseen enemies. Long before the name was reclaimed by a real fighting force, it was as though the collective memory of the Commonwealth itself guided its people toward rediscovering an identity rooted not in pre-war bureaucracy or corporate power, but in a much older, almost primal American ideal: the defense of one's home and neighbors against tyranny. This resonance with the past was no coincidence. The Commonwealth was steeped in symbolism, and those who survived there were constantly confronted with reminders of who their ancestors had been. The Old North Church, though battered and hollowed by time, still stood as a silent sentinel over the city, its spire piercing the gray skies, as it had done during the first American Revolution. The Freedom Trail, now covered in debris and ash, remained visible in fragments, a literal path through the ruins, a pilgrimage for those who sought to reconnect with the forgotten ideals of freedom and unity. Even the Minutemen's later use of the church as a sanctuary for another revolutionary group, the Railroad, would underscore how deeply intertwined the Commonwealth's future was with its past. But the echoes of the old world were not merely inspirational, they were also cautionary. The same institutions that had once celebrated liberty had, by the time of the Great War, become engines of exploitation and hubris. The descendants of the Founding Fathers had built not a utopia of freedom, but a society enslaved by its own technology and political corruption. The survivors of the Commonwealth knew this, even if they could not articulate it. They saw the rusting hulks of pre-war robots still patrolling streets on corrupted programming, the skeletons of civilians still seated at their kitchen tables, the ruins of military checkpoints that once promised protection but delivered annihilation. To them, the old world was both a source of pride and a warning. It was a reminder that civilization, no matter how enlightened, could collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. Thus, when the first stirrings of unity began to take hold in the Commonwealth, they were accompanied by a conscious rejection of the hierarchies and excesses of the pre-war government. The people wanted protection, not politics, leadership, not bureaucracy, and so the philosophical groundwork for the Minutemen contained within it both homage and rebellion, a return to the virtues of the past without repeating its sins. They would take up the imagery of the old American patriots, the tricorn hats, the militia ethos, the notion of the citizen soldier, but strip away the nationalism and empire that had corrupted those ideals in later centuries. In this sense, the Commonwealth Minutemen were not merely inheritors of a name, but reinterpreters of an entire legacy. Where the pre-war United States had sought to expand power through domination, the post-war Minutemen sought to preserve it through cooperation. The choice of their name was both poetic and deliberate. It spoke to readiness, to the belief that every person should be willing to defend their home at a moment's notice. The symbolism of the Minuteman statue in Concord, long eroded but still standing amid the cracked pavements, became an almost sacred site to early settlers. Some records suggest that early Commonwealth militias would make pilgrimages there before major defensive efforts, drawing courage from the weathered bronze image of the colonial farmer turned soldier. The echo of the old world was thus not passive nostalgia, it was an active force shaping the moral architecture of the new society emerging from the ashes. The Minutemen, even before their formal unification, were already embodying this synthesis of myth and practicality, adopting the past not as dogma, but as inspiration. Their understanding of liberty was not about flag or nation, but about community, the freedom to live without fear, to raise families without enslavement by raiders or technocratic tyrants. In this, they differed profoundly from other emerging factions of the wasteland. The Brotherhood of Steel revered technology. The Enclave worshipped the old government. The Railroad fixated on the liberation of synths. Only the Minutemen sought to revive something as intangible and human as hope itself. This reverence for history was further reinforced by the geography of the Commonwealth itself. Boston's architecture, even in ruin, retained its revolutionary character. The narrow streets, the old red brick homes, the courtyards that once echoed with the footsteps of patriots. In these familiar shapes, settlers found continuity, a bridge between the lost world and the one they were trying to rebuild. Some communities even attempted to restore historical buildings, not out of aesthetic nostalgia, but as an act of reclamation. a declaration that the past still belonged to the living. One can imagine a ragtag group of settlers patching holes in the walls of a colonial-era meeting house, not realizing that in doing so, they were continuing a tradition of civic assembly that stretched back centuries. This instinct to rebuild from the old rather than discard it was emblematic of the Commonwealth mindset. It is perhaps no coincidence that when the Minutemen later formalized their command structure, they adopted a form of democratic decision-making reminiscent of early town meetings. Their leaders were not appointed by divine right or military hierarchy, but by consensus and reputation. The title of general, though grand in sound, was rooted in service rather than supremacy. In this way, the echoes of the old world shaped not only their symbols, but their very institutions. Yet, the reverence for the old ways was not without its contradictions. The same myths that inspired courage could also breed disillusionment. For every settler who saw the Minutemen as the rebirth of American virtue, there was another who viewed them as naive dreamers, clinging to the corpse of a dead world. Some argued that the old ideals had failed once and would fail again, that cooperation was weakness in a world ruled by force. Such voices often found power among raider groups and warlords, whose brutal philosophies were grounded in a far older law, the survival of the fittest. These clashing ideologies made the Commonwealth a crucible of moral conflict long before its wars began. The people who would become Minutemen thus defined themselves not only by what they fought for, but by what they refused to become. They refused to be raiders, refused to be slaves to technology or zealotry, refused to abandon the notion that decency itself could survive the apocalypse. In that refusal lay their true inheritance from the old world. By the time the Commonwealth Minutemen emerged as a recognizable organization, their identity was already centuries in the making, distilled from the accumulated weight of memory and myth. They were the children of a civilization that had destroyed itself and the heirs to its greatest lesson, that freedom cannot be handed down by governments or preserved by technology alone. It must be guarded by those who live it. Thus, the echoes of the old world did more than inspire the Minutemen. They defined them. The ghosts of patriots, inventors, and dreamers still haunted the streets of Boston, not as specters of loss, but as reminders of potential. And though the Commonwealth would endure many more tragedies before finding stability, the philosophical rebirth that began amid its ruins ensured that the idea of the Minutemen, ordinary citizens united in defense of each other, would become not merely a faction, but a reflection of humanity's oldest and most enduring hope, that even in the darkest night, the light of liberty need not go out completely, so long as there are hands willing to shield its flame. In the decades following the initial scattering of survivors across the Commonwealth, as the first tentative settlements struggled against raiders, supermutants, and the ever-present threat of starvation, the town of Concord emerged as a focal point for the fledgling movement that would eventually coalesce into the Commonwealth Minutemen, a place where geography, history, and circumstance converged to make it the symbolic heart of collective resistance and organized defense. Concord, with its pre-war significance as a site of revolutionary action during the 18th century, carried with it an aura that resonated deeply with survivors seeking meaning amid the ruins, its streets and open fields serving as both a literal and figurative canvas upon which the ideals of civic cooperation and citizen-led defense could be painted anew. And it was here, among the fractured buildings and partially restored homes, that the earliest leaders of the Minutemen began to convene meetings, not in grand halls but in modest courtyards, barns, and surviving colonial structures, using whatever resources were at hand to assemble representatives from nearby settlements like Lexington, Sanctuary Hills, and Ten Pines Bluff, recognizing that only through coordinated action could they hope to survive the predatory forces that had turned the Commonwealth into a battleground of desperation. These early gatherings were marked by a profound tension between hope and skepticism, as each settlement had endured years of isolation and was naturally wary of entrusting its safety to outsiders. Yet the repeated encounters with raider bands and mutant incursions created an undeniable logic for unity, and thus, through painstaking negotiation and countless conversations around makeshift tables, a proto-constitution began to take shape, emphasizing voluntary service, mutual defense, and decentralized command, principles that would become the backbone of the Minutemen ethos, ensuring that the organization would never resemble the authoritarian structures that had failed the old world, but would instead rely on the cooperation, courage, and commitment of ordinary citizens, each of whom was both participant and guardian, invested in the survival of their neighbors as much as their own. Central to the founding process were figures whose names have been partially lost to history, but whose deeds were recorded in fragments, oral traditions, and recovered holotapes. Individuals who understood that leadership in the post-war Commonwealth required not dominance, but example. Men and women willing to risk life and limb to respond to threats, train volunteers, and teach marksmanship and survival skills to those who had never held a weapon. And through these efforts, Concord became the symbolic capital of a movement rooted not in hierarchy but in principle, where the Minutemen's first formalized responses to raider attacks, skirmishes with mutant bands, and the defense of trade routes demonstrated the practical value of unity, cementing the idea that collective action could not only prevent destruction, but restore confidence and morale across the region. Over time, these coordinated efforts attracted survivors from farther afield, who brought knowledge of pre-war technology, rudimentary radio equipment, and improvised weaponry, expanding the Minutemen network beyond the immediate vicinity of Concord and creating an embryonic communications infrastructure that would later enable rapid deployment in crises. And while early successes were often modest, a repelled raider, ambush here, a recovered shipment there, each victory reinforced the belief that ordinary citizens could reclaim agency in a world dominated by chaos and violence, and that the ideals of the past, evoked by the very streets and monuments of Concord, could be translated into tangible protection and governance without reproducing the failures of pre-war authority. Importantly, the founding at Concord established a set of ethical guidelines and cultural norms that would define the Minutemen for generations, stressing restraint, respect for civilians, and prioritization of defense over conquest, a philosophy that distinguished them sharply from other rising factions in the Commonwealth. From the Brotherhood of Steel with their obsession with hoarded technology, to the opportunistic raiders who preyed upon the weak, and it was within this context that the Minutemen's identity crystallized as a citizen-led militia, a collective determined to act as the moral and physical shield for those who had no other protection, while simultaneously preserving the symbolic continuity of Massachusetts' revolutionary heritage, thereby linking the contemporary struggle for survival with centuries-old narratives of courage, resistance, and self-determination. The actual logistics of the founding involved more than rhetoric and ideals, encompassing the establishment of watchposts, rudimentary training routines, shared armories, and early systems of alert signaling. often employing what remained of pre-war communication devices patched together with scavenged parts, creating a network that allowed rapid mobilization across disparate settlements, while simultaneously embedding the values of mutual accountability, volunteerism, and local autonomy, ensuring that no single individual or settlement could dominate the fledgling organization, and that participation itself became a civic duty as much as a military necessity. By the time these early protocols were codified, Concord had become more than a settlement. It was the living embodiment of the Minutemen's vision, a tangible center from which the principles of protection, cooperation, and hope radiated outward into the Commonwealth. And though countless challenges lay ahead, raider sieges, mutant incursions, resource scarcity, and eventual catastrophic events like the Quincy massacre, the foundations laid in Concord during this period provided the Quincy enduring philosophical and practical framework that allowed the Minutemen to survive, rebuild, and ultimately thrive as a symbol of the human capacity to restore order and meaning, even after the collapse of civilization, demonstrating that the act of uniting under a common cause, inspired by history but adapted to the realities of the post-apocalyptic landscape, could produce not just survival, but the revival of a civic identity, rooted in the timeless ideals of liberty, courage, and communal responsibility, ideals that would echo throughout the Commonwealth for generations to come, and form the indelible core of what it meant to be a Minuteman. In the years following the formal gatherings at Concord and the initial coordination among the early settlements, the Commonwealth Minutemen gradually evolved from a loose network of volunteers into a structured militia guided by principles that would come to be understood as their foundational constitution, a set of unwritten yet deeply respected rules and ethical codes, designed not only to facilitate defense against the constant threats of raiders, supermutants, and feral ghouls, but also to ensure that the fragile moral integrity of the organization remained intact amidst the harshness of the post-war world. This constitution, though never codified in a single text, emerged organically from decades of collective experience, reflecting the lived realities of communities that had endured years of isolation, scarcity, and violence, and it emphasized several core tenets that would distinguish the Minutemen from all other factions across the Commonwealth, beginning with the principle that every able-bodied citizen had both the right and the duty to defend their home and neighbors, a civic responsibility that drew inspiration from the historical Minutemen of the American Revolution and from the broader pre-war ideals of liberty, mutual aid, and self-governance, yet was adapted to the brutal exigencies of survival in a nuclear wasteland, where law and order had ceased to exist. The Minutemen Constitution also codified a deeply democratic ethos in practice, ensuring that leadership was contingent upon merit, courage, and demonstrated commitment rather than inheritance, coercion, or pretense, and that generals and officers derived authority from the consent of the communities they served, a stark contrast to the hierarchies of the pre-war military-industrial complex and the authoritarian tendencies of factions such as the Brotherhood of Steel or the remnants of the Enclave. And while these principles were flexible enough to allow for operational adaptation in emergencies, they were rigid enough to preserve the moral core of the organization, creating a culture in which the Minutemen could function effectively as both defenders and symbols of civic virtue. Practical elements of this constitution encompass the development of response protocols, establishing chains of communication between settlements through runners, signal fires, and eventually improvised radio networks, ensuring that distress calls could be answered swiftly, Despite the scattered and often isolated nature of the Commonwealth communities, and it also included the establishment of volunteer militias within each settlement, trained to defend their own homes while remaining ready to assist others, a system that balanced local autonomy with regional solidarity and minimized the risk of centralization of power that could lead to corruption or tyranny, a concern that weighed heavily on the founders who had witnessed the destructive potential of centralized authority both in pre-war government and the catastrophic military-industrial complex that had precipitated the Great War. Furthermore, the ethical dimension of the Constitution dictated rules of engagement that prioritized civilian safety and restraint, rejecting indiscriminate violence and looting as tactics of war, instead encouraging Minutemen forces to engage only when necessary, and to protect settlements as a moral imperative rather than as a means of conquest, a philosophical stance that would later define the Minutemen's distinct identity compared to raider bands, opportunistic mercenaries, or technologically obsessed factions, and which reinforced the sense that the Minutemen were not merely a military organization, but a living extension of community values, where each member's loyalty to neighbors and adherence to these unwritten laws were as critical as skill with a weapon or strategic acumen. Over time, the Constitution also codified the principles of accountability and transparency, mandating that leaders report their actions to the communities they served, that decision-making processes remain visible and participatory, and that disputes or allegations of misconduct could be resolved collectively, often through assemblies that echoed the traditions of pre-war town meetings, creating a culture in which power was continually checked by collective will, and in which the success of the organization depended not on fear or coercion, but on trust, mutual respect, and shared responsibility, an ethos that distinguished the Minutemen even in a world where moral compromise was often the only alternative to survival. Alongside these ideological and structural elements, the Constitution also recognized the necessity of flexibility, allowing settlements to adapt the Minutemen principles to their unique circumstances, while remaining bound by the broader ethical framework, ensuring that the network could grow without collapsing under the pressures of regional diversity, resource scarcity, and environmental hazards, and enabling the Minutemen to survive periods of severe attrition, natural disasters, and raider attacks, conditions under which less adaptable organizations would have failed. The Constitution's influence extended to the development of the Minutemen's distinctive culture, fostering ceremonies, rituals, and symbols that reinforced unity and identity, such as the raising of the flag over the castle, the oath-taking of volunteers, and the regular patrolling and training of young recruits. Practices that instilled a sense of purpose and continuity, linking the lived experience of survival with the historical legacy of Massachusetts and the American Revolution. It also provided the philosophical foundation for decision-making during crises, ensuring that leaders and volunteers alike understood that the protection of human life and the maintenance of communal integrity were paramount, a principle that would guide every campaign, every rescue mission, and every effort to rebuild settlements in the face of devastation. From early skirmishes with raiders to the more complex operations of later years involving the defense of the castle, coordination with allied factions, and the strategic reclamation of territory previously lost to chaos. In essence, the Constitution of the Commonwealth Minutemen was both a practical blueprint for survival and a moral compass, a framework that allowed scattered individuals to act collectively without sacrificing their humanity, ensuring that the Minutemen could endure as a force that was not merely militarily competent, but ethically grounded, a citizen-led network capable of protecting communities, inspiring confidence, and offering a tangible embodiment of hope in a landscape defined by ruin, radiation, and loss. And it was this careful balance of pragmatism and principle, flexibility, and ethical rigor that enabled the Minutemen not only to survive the immediate dangers of the post-war Commonwealth, but also to establish an enduring model of civic responsibility and mutual defense, one that would allow future generations to inherit a network of protection, solidarity, and shared purpose, and to reclaim the very idea that ordinary people working together in accordance with a well-understood code of conduct could restore order, security, and humanity to a world where both had been nearly extinguished. As the fledgling Commonwealth Minutemen gradually solidified their structure and extended their influence across Concord, Sanctuary Hills, Ten Pines, Bluff, and the surrounding settlements, the need for recognized leadership became increasingly apparent. Not to establish dominion, but to coordinate the defense of a growing network of communities that were vulnerable to raider incursions, mutant attacks, and other hazards endemic to a post-nuclear landscape. And it was within this context that the role of the general emerged, a figure whose authority was both practical and symbolic, embodying the collective will of the Minutemen, while remaining accountable to the communities they served. This position, though later formalized and associated most famously with Preston Garvey in the aftermath of the Quincy massacre, was initially shaped by a series of predecessors whose names have largely been lost to history, but whose actions laid the groundwork for the leadership model that would endure. Men and women who demonstrated tactical acumen, personal courage, and a steadfast commitment to the protection of civilians, earning the trust of local settlement leaders and volunteers alike through repeated acts of heroism and judicious decision-making. The general was responsible for organizing patrols, coordinating reinforcements, allocating scarce resources such as firearms, ammunition, and medical supplies, and ensuring that settlements responded to one another's calls for aid, a delicate balance between strategic oversight and respect for the autonomy of individual communities. For the Minutemen Constitution emphasized that authority existed to serve, not to dominate, and that the ultimate purpose of the organization was the defense of people rather than the accumulation of power. The rise of a general often coincided with periods of crisis, as early Minutemen faced attacks from increasingly organized raider gangs, roving supermutants, and the occasional incursions of pre-war automated defense systems or remnants of corporate militias. And it was during these engagements that the qualities of leadership were tested, from the ability to inspire volunteers who had never seen combat to the tactical acumen required to outmaneuver better-armed adversaries using terrain, improvisation, and intelligence gathered from allied settlements, and to maintain morale in communities traumatized by loss and hardship. In these formative campaigns, the general functioned as both strategist and mentor, imparting knowledge of survival skills, weaponry, and rudimentary logistics, while reinforcing the ethical framework of the Minutemen, emphasizing restraint, protection of civilians, and adherence to the principles enshrined in the Constitution of the Wasteland, ensuring that every decision, from the allocation of volunteers to the choice of engagement, reflected both practical necessity and moral integrity. This dual role, practical and symbolic, allowed the general to unify disparate settlements into a coherent network capable of coordinated defense, establishing the Minutemen not as a collection of isolated militias, but as a singular movement with shared purpose. And it was this consolidation of leadership and organizational capability that allowed the Minutemen to begin reclaiming territory lost to raiders, reinforce critical trade routes, and demonstrate to the broader population of the Commonwealth that collective action could restore order and hope where chaos had previously reigned. Historical accounts, supplemented by holotape records, survivor testimonies, and archaeological evidence from early Minutemen posts, suggest that the rise of the general also involved negotiation and diplomacy, for the post-war Commonwealth was never a homogeneous entity, but a patchwork of settlements with varying priorities, resources, and degrees of willingness to cooperate, and it fell to the general to mediate disputes, facilitate resource sharing, and ensure that the Minutemen network functioned as a cohesive unit, rather than fracturing under the pressures of scarcity and fear, a task as critical as any combat operation, for the failure to maintain unity would render any tactical victories meaningless. As the network expanded, the general's influence extended not only to military strategy, but also to community development, coordinating reconstruction of defensive fortifications, training programs for volunteers, and communication networks that enabled rapid response across the Commonwealth, including signal fires, radio relays, and courier systems, effectively creating an early warning system that became the lifeblood of Minutemen operations. Over time, the general became a symbol of stability, hope, and moral authority, a living representation of the Minutemen's ideals, and an embodiment of the notion that ordinary citizens, when united under principled leadership, could reclaim the fractured Commonwealth, restore security to vulnerable settlements, and uphold the legacy of cooperation, courage, and civic responsibility that had inspired the Minutemen's founding in Concord. The position was not without peril, as generals were frequently targeted during campaigns, their presence required on dangerous front lines, and their decisions often carried life or death consequences for volunteers and civilians alike, yet the continuity of leadership allowed the organization to endure, enabling the Minutemen to withstand catastrophic events such as the Quincy massacre, which decimated their ranks, disrupted communications, and tested the resilience of their moral and structural framework. And it was in the wake of such disasters that the true significance of the general became evident, as leaders like Preston Garvey not only rebuilt the organization from near collapse, but also reaffirmed the principles of volunteerism, mutual defense, and ethical conduct that had defined the Minutemen from their earliest days, demonstrating that the role of the general was as much about preserving the soul of the organization as directing its military operations. Ultimately, the rise of the general represented the crystallization of the Minutemen's capacity to act as a unified, principled force within the chaos of the post-apocalyptic Commonwealth, combining tactical competence, ethical rigor, and symbolic authority to transform scattered militias into a resilient network of defense and community support. And it was through the leadership of these early generals that the Minutemen not only survived the most perilous years following the Great War, but also laid the foundation for the enduring institution that would later become a beacon of hope, structure, and collective courage for the inhabitants of the Commonwealth, proving that even in a world shattered by nuclear fire, the combination of ordinary citizens and principled leadership could restore order, protect the vulnerable, and embody the timeless ideals of unity, responsibility, and human dignity. As the Commonwealth Minutemen transitioned from their embryonic organizational phase into a fully operational citizen militia, the volatile and fragmented landscape around them demanded constant engagement in a series of conflicts that would collectively come to be known as the Wars of the Commonwealth, a prolonged and multifaceted struggle involving not only raiders and bandits, but also super-mutant incursions, hostile mercenary groups, and the unpredictable threats posed by remnants of pre-war technology and experimental weapons, all of which tested the Minutemen's capacity for coordinated defense, strategic planning, and ethical decision-making in a world where the rules of civilization had largely vanished. These wars were not formalized campaigns in the sense of pre-war military doctrine, but rather a sequence of reactive and often improvisational operations conducted by volunteers who were trained more in survival and civic duty than professional combat, and yet the Minutemen rapidly developed a reputation for effectiveness due to their ability to leverage intimate knowledge of local terrain, maintain communication between settlements, and utilize a decentralized command structure that allowed rapid response to emergent threats while ensuring that no single setback would paralyze the entire network, a strategic approach that proved crucial in an environment where a single raider ambush or super mutant attack could destroy a settlement entirely. Early engagements often involved defending caravans, traversing dangerous routes between settlements, protecting isolated farms, and repelling opportunistic raids on storage caches containing food, medical supplies, and salvageable pre-war technology, which were vital for the survival of the communities that relied upon them, and these seemingly small-scale skirmishes gradually evolved into more complex operations as the Minutemen established patrol patterns, constructed rudimentary fortifications, and coordinated multi-settlement responses to threats that could span miles across the irradiated landscape, demonstrating the practical benefits of a networked militia rooted in civic cooperation rather than hierarchical authority. The Minutemen's military doctrine, such as it was, relied heavily on principles derived from their founding ethos: the protection of civilians, the restraint from unnecessary aggression, and the use of force as a defensive measure rather than a tool of domination, a stark contrast to the raider gangs that plundered settlements without discrimination or concern for non-combatants, and which also set them apart from factions like the Brotherhood of Steel, whose focus on technology hoarding often prioritized tactical advantage over community welfare, or the Enclave, whose methods reflected the authoritarian and often morally compromised practices of the pre-war federal government, emphasizing the Minutemen's identity as a morally grounded force whose legitimacy derived from the consent and trust of the people they defended. Throughout these wars of the Commonwealth, the Minutemen faced numerous logistical and ethical challenges, including shortages of trained volunteers, weaponry, and medical supplies, as well as the constant balancing act of allocating forces between multiple simultaneous crises. And these pressures demanded not only tactical ingenuity, but also the cultivation of leadership that could inspire volunteers, mediate inter-settlement disputes, and make rapid judgments under extreme stress, qualities that were personified by the position of the general, whose decisions often determined the survival or destruction of entire communities, and whose ethical framework ensured that the Minutemen remained distinct from the morally ambiguous or outright malevolent groups that populated the Commonwealth. Beyond the tactical and operational elements, these wars carried a profound psychological and cultural impact, as victories and defeats alike shaped the collective identity of the Minutemen and reinforced the narrative that ordinary citizens, acting in unity and guided by principled leadership, could resist chaos and reclaim a measure of stability in a fractured world. And the stories of these engagements, preserved in oral history, recovered holotapes, and surviving records, served to inspire subsequent generations of volunteers, reinforcing a culture of courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to the defense of the people, even when facing overwhelming odds. Notable engagements included repelling coordinated raider attacks on settlements like Sanctuary Hills and the outskirts of Concord, where volunteers employed a combination of improvised fortifications, reconnaissance, and terrain advantage to offset the numerical superiority of their enemies, as well as confrontations with super-mutant patrols, whose unpredictable behavior and superior physical strength necessitated careful planning, strategic patience, and coordinated group tactics to minimize casualties while effectively neutralizing threats. And in each case, the Minutemen demonstrated an ability to adapt, learn, and refine both their logistical networks and combat strategies in real time, laying the groundwork for the more sophisticated operations that would define later periods of Minutemen activity. The psychological impact of these wars extended beyond the immediate combatants, shaping the perception of the Minutemen throughout the Commonwealth as both protectors and symbols of hope. And while they could not prevent every tragedy, some settlements were destroyed despite their efforts. Their presence created a deterrent effect, emboldening survivors to resist raider pressure, encouraging communities to invest in mutual defense, and establishing a broader culture of resilience and self-reliance, all of which contributed to the gradual stabilization of certain regions, despite the ongoing threats of the wasteland. In essence, the wars of the Commonwealth were as much about the Minutemen's internal development as they were about external conflict, serving to solidify command structures, refine operational doctrine, and cultivate the ethos that defined the organization. That ordinary citizens, united under a shared ethical framework and guided by principled leadership, could resist chaos, defend the vulnerable, and rebuild fragments of civilization from the ashes of destruction. And it was through these prolonged struggles that the Minutemen's identity matured. Their reputation as a disciplined, morally grounded, and reliable force was established, and their role as the guardian network of the Commonwealth became inseparable from the narrative of human perseverance in the post-apocalyptic landscape, ensuring that the story of the Minutemen's early wars would resonate throughout subsequent generations as both a practical lesson in survival and a moral exemplar of what organized, principled community action could achieve even in the most unforgiving of worlds. The Quincy massacre stands as one of the most defining and tragic events in the early history of the Commonwealth Minutemen, a catastrophic confrontation that exemplified both the fragility of fledgling civic organizations in the post-war landscape and the extraordinary resilience required to survive and rebuild in the face of overwhelming adversity. Occurring in the mid-22 ND century, though precise dating is difficult due to the inconsistent record-keeping of the period, the massacre involved the systematic destruction of a Minutemen outpost and the surrounding civilian population by a large coalition of raider forces whose motivations were a mixture of vengeance, opportunism, and the desire to destabilize the nascent network of community defense. And the event ultimately decimated not only the volunteer ranks stationed in Quincy, but also the infrastructure that had been painstakingly assembled to secure the region, including supply depots, watchtowers, and communications lines, leaving a vacuum that threatened to undo decades of careful organization and morale building. Historical accounts, preserved in fragmented holotapes, survivor testimony, and recovered logs, indicate that the raiders, taking advantage of gaps in patrol schedules and exploiting weaknesses in early warning systems, launched a coordinated assault that combined frontal attacks on defensive positions with flanking maneuvers to cut off escape routes and the scale of their operation, estimated at several dozen well-armed combatants equipped with pre-war firearms and scavenged armor, overwhelmed the undertrained and ill-equipped Minutemen volunteers, many of whom had been stationed at Quincy to protect the civilian population, rather than to engage in large-scale combat, reflecting the perennial tension in the Minutemen's operational doctrine between defense and engagement. The aftermath of the massacre was catastrophic. Dozens of Minutemen were killed or captured, countless civilians perished, and the surviving volunteers were forced to retreat to neighboring settlements, carrying with them the dual burdens of grief and responsibility. And the shock wave from Quincy reverberated throughout the Commonwealth, undermining confidence in the Minutemen's ability to protect the people and causing temporary fractures in inter-settlement cooperation, as some communities questioned the wisdom of relying on a volunteer militia in the face of organized violent threats. However, it is precisely in this crucible of disaster that the enduring character and philosophical foundations of the Minutemen were tested and ultimately reinforced, as survivors and remaining leadership, including figures who would later become central to the organization's revival, engaged in a period of reflection, reorganization, and doctrinal refinement, analyzing the failures that had contributed to the disaster, ranging from insufficient reconnaissance, inadequate communication networks, gaps in training, and the absence of a unified command during the attack, and implementing systemic changes to prevent future catastrophes, including the establishment of more robust patrol routines, standardized training programs for new recruits, and the construction of fortified positions capable of withstanding larger and more coordinated assaults. The Quincy massacre also had profound symbolic significance, marking the moment at which the Minutemen fully embraced the mantle of civic guardianship with an acute awareness of the consequences of failure, and it galvanized both survivors and nearby settlements to recommit to the principles of volunteerism, mutual defense, and ethical conduct that had defined the organization since its founding, ensuring that the lessons of Quincy were internalized not merely as tactical corrections, but as moral imperatives to protect the vulnerable, uphold community cohesion, and prevent the repetition of such tragedies. Culturally and psychologically, the massacre became a touchstone for Minutemen identity, memorialized through oral history, survivor narratives, and commemorative practices, reinforcing a collective memory that underscored both the cost of negligence and the necessity of courage, sacrifice, and vigilance. And over time, the event would be used as a case study for training new generations of volunteers, emphasizing the critical importance of coordination, preparedness, and ethical responsibility in a world where even the most noble intentions could result in catastrophe, if not executed with diligence and foresight. Moreover, the Quincy massacre shaped the leadership model within the Minutemen, illustrating the indispensability of a strong, accountable general capable of uniting volunteers, making rapid strategic decisions under pressure, and inspiring both confidence and resilience in the face of devastating loss. And it is from the post-Quincy rebuilding efforts that figures such as Preston Garvey and his predecessors emerged, demonstrating a blend of tactical skill, moral clarity, and charismatic authority that would define the role of the general for centuries to come. Politically and socially, the massacre had the paradoxical effect of strengthening inter-settlement alliances as neighboring communities, witnessing the vulnerability of Quincy, recognized the necessity of mutual support, and began to formalize cooperative defense agreements, contributing to the growth of the Minutemen network, while also attracting new volunteers motivated by both a sense of duty and the desire to honor those who had fallen. And in this way, the tragedy became a catalyst for organizational consolidation, doctrinal innovation, and the deepening of civic ethos that distinguished the Minutemen from other factions in the Commonwealth, demonstrating that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, collective resolve and principled leadership could transform disaster into the foundation for enduring strength, moral legitimacy, and the sustained defense of communities across the irradiated landscape. In retrospect, the Quincy Massacre serves as a pivotal event in the history of the Commonwealth Minutemen, not merely as a military defeat, but as a transformative crucible that clarified the organization's purpose, solidified its ethical framework, and ensured that future generations of volunteers would inherit both the practical knowledge and the moral imperatives necessary to safeguard the Commonwealth, preserve human dignity, and maintain the continuity of civic life in a world where chaos and violence threaten to obliterate all traces of civilization, proving that even in the aftermath of overwhelming tragedy, the spirit of cooperation, sacrifice, and principled defense could endure and ultimately flourish, cementing the Minutemen's reputation as the guardians of the people and the living embodiment of hope in a land scarred by nuclear fire. The period following the Quincy Massacre marked one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Commonwealth Minutemen, a time when the organization teetered on the edge of complete disintegration as the catastrophic loss of volunteers, infrastructure, and civilian lives exposed both the fragility of their networks and the limitations of a citizen-led militia facing threats of unprecedented scale. In the immediate aftermath, many settlements found themselves isolated, their communication lines severed or rendered unreliable, patrol schedules disrupted, and local leaders overwhelmed by the dual burdens of grief and survival. And this vacuum of authority created opportunities for opportunists, raider leaders, and self-styled champions to assert control, claiming the mantle of Minutemen leadership without the ethical grounding, organizational skill, or communal legitimacy that had historically defined the movement, leading to confusion, mistrust, and fragmentation among the survivors who had once relied upon the militia for protection. As the network unraveled, stories of false generals, rogue militias, and exploitative figures proliferated, eroding the credibility of the Minutemen brand and causing many settlements to question the efficacy of the organization, while resource scarcity, constant raids, and the psychological trauma of witnessing friends and neighbors slaughtered further accelerated the decline, as volunteers either abandoned their posts, migrated to more secure locations, or perished in desperate defensive actions, leaving large swathes of the Commonwealth defenseless and reinforcing the perception that the Minutemen were a relic of a bygone era, incapable of fulfilling the promises of protection and unity that had once inspired hope. Amid this chaos, Preston Garvey, who would later rise to prominence as a key figure in the revival of the Minutemen, emerged as a solitary witness to the collapse, navigating the ruins of Concord, Quincy, and neighboring settlements with a mixture of grief, rage, and determination. His survival, a combination of skill, luck, and the lessons imparted during his early training and service, and yet the experience left him deeply disillusioned, as he saw firsthand the consequences of leadership failure, the vulnerability of unprepared communities, and the ease with which well-intentioned structures could be co-opted, corrupted, or destroyed by both external threats and human ambition. Garvey's disillusionment was compounded by the difficulty of locating any remaining allies, as former comrades were either deceased, scattered, or unwilling to re-engage in a system that had so visibly failed, forcing him to confront the possibility that the ideals of mutual defense, civic duty, and principled leadership might have been irretrievably lost to a world dominated by opportunism, violence, and survivalism. Yet it was precisely this period of isolation, observation, and reflection that would later inform his philosophy as general, instilling a deep appreciation for communication, accountability, ethical leadership, and the necessity of rebuilding trust before attempting to rebuild infrastructure. The fall of the Minutemen in this era was not sudden but progressive, a cascading failure in which one compromised settlement or decimated volunteer group precipitated vulnerability in the surrounding network, revealing the fragility of an organization dependent upon the cooperation and moral commitment of ordinary citizens in a hostile environment. And while some settlements attempted to maintain the facade of Minutemen protection, their efforts were often superficial, marked by empty titles, minimal defensive capability, and a lack of coordination, leaving civilians exposed to the whims of raiders, feral creatures, and unscrupulous leaders, and thereby reinforcing the narrative of decline and the perception that the Minutemen had become a symbol of what was lost rather than what could be restored. Yet within this desolation, Garvey's survival carried both practical and symbolic significance, as he retained the knowledge, skills, and ethical framework that would later form the backbone of the Minutemen's revival. Observing the failures of others, understanding the importance of credible leadership, and internalizing the necessity of restoring communication, re-establishing trust, and prioritizing the defense of civilians before expansion or ambition, a process that would eventually allow him to act as the catalyst for reuniting scattered settlements, reclaiming the moral authority of the Minutemen name, and transforming a shattered, disillusioned population into a coordinated, principled force capable of once again asserting control over critical areas of the Commonwealth. In this sense, the fall of the Minutemen following Quincy was both literal and symbolic, representing not only the physical collapse of their network of settlements and defensive positions, but also the erosion of collective faith in the organization's capacity to provide protection and moral guidance as communities confronted the stark reality that volunteerism alone could not withstand the combined pressures of external predation and internal opportunism, and that the absence of reliable leadership could leave even the most resilient settlements vulnerable to destruction. During this period, false claimants to leadership proliferated, each asserting authority based on charisma, promises of protection, or exploitation of Minutemen insignia, yet lacking the ethical foundation, strategic understanding, or commitment to communal welfare that had previously defined the organization, creating confusion, factionalism, and sometimes violent conflict between rival groups, claiming legitimacy, further destabilizing the region and eroding the Minutemen's credibility in the eyes of ordinary citizens. Preston Garvey, navigating this fractured landscape, bore witness to the human cost of the collapse, encountering survivors traumatized by loss, leaders corrupted by ambition, and communities abandoned in the absence of coordinated defense. And it was through this exposure that he internalized the lessons of accountability, the necessity of credible command, and the moral weight of leadership in a world where decisions could mean life or death, recognizing that survival depended as much on the cultivation of trust, ethical conduct, and organizational coherence as on weaponry, fortifications, or tactical skill. Despite the devastation, Garvey's continued survival preserved a link to the original Minutemen ethos, carrying forward both knowledge of pre-Quincy operational strategies and the philosophical underpinnings of mutual defense, community responsibility, and principled leadership, allowing him to later rebuild the organization with an emphasis on restoring communication between settlements, re-establishing trust among volunteers, and reclaiming the moral authority that had been lost during the chaos, ultimately transforming the ashes of disillusionment into the foundation for a renewed, resilient, and ethically grounded network capable of once again protecting the people of the Commonwealth and reaffirming the timeless ideals of unity, courage, and civic duty that had defined the Minutemen from their founding in Concord, proving that even after near-total collapse, the combination of principled leadership, perseverance, and a deep understanding of past failures could restore both functionality and hope in a fractured, post-apocalyptic landscape. In the aftermath of the disintegration that followed the Quincy massacre and the subsequent collapse of centralized coordination, Preston Garvey found himself and the remnants of the Commonwealth Minutemen isolated within the walls of the Museum of Freedom in Concord, a location that, though partially restored, served less as a bastion of strength than as a fragile refuge for a handful of volunteers and survivors, clinging to the memory of what the organization had once represented. The dwindling numbers of the group reflected both the catastrophic losses sustained in previous conflicts and the erosion of faith among volunteers who had witnessed the failures of leadership and the unchecked violence of raiders, supermutants, and opportunists across the Commonwealth, leaving Garvey with the nearly impossible task of maintaining morale, coordinating defensive measures, and preserving the ethical and operational framework of the Minutemen with insufficient manpower, scarce resources, and a pervasive sense of despair that threatened to render the organization extinct. The Museum of Freedom, symbolic in its association with Massachusetts' revolutionary heritage, became both a literal and figurative sanctuary. Its fortifications, cannons, and surviving structures representing the tenuous hold the Minutemen maintained over a fractured region. Yet despite these advantages, the volunteers faced relentless pressure from external threats, supply shortages, and the psychological strain of defending a symbolic position, while their influence and reach across the Commonwealth had contracted to near irrelevance, demonstrating the precarious balance between survival and collapse in a post-apocalyptic landscape where every misstep could prove fatal. It was during this period of extreme vulnerability that Garvey's leadership, tempered by experience, reflection, and the lessons of the Quincy disaster, became the organizing principle holding together the last remnants of the Quincy Minutemen as he coordinated training, rationing, patrols, and reconnaissance with limited volunteers, emphasizing both practical defense and the preservation of morale, instilling in his small group the understanding that even in the face of overwhelming odds, adherence to ethical principles, strategic patience, and communal solidarity could create the possibility of survival and eventual resurgence. The narrative of the last Minutemen is inseparable from the arrival of an unexpected wanderer, a lone individual whose intervention, whether motivated by altruism, curiosity, or circumstance, provided the critical manpower, strategic insight, and moral encouragement necessary to shift the trajectory from inevitable extinction to potential revival. And it is through this encounter that Garvey and his remaining volunteers found a renewed sense of purpose, gaining not only an ally in the defense of Concord, but also a catalyst for the restoration of the Minutemen's operational capacity, allowing them to expand communication networks, reclaim nearby settlements, and begin the painstaking process of rebuilding trust and infrastructure that had been eroded during the previous period of collapse. The significance of this encounter extended beyond the immediate tactical benefits, as it symbolized the enduring principle upon which the Minutemen had been founded, that the collective action of ordinary individuals, united under a shared commitment to protect the vulnerable and uphold ethical leadership, could overcome despair and transform fragmented, hopeless remnants into a coherent, functioning organization capable of defending the people and preserving the ideals of civic responsibility, courage, and cooperation, illustrating that even the last of the Minutemen, facing near total annihilation, could serve as a foundation for renewal, provided that leadership, perseverance, and timely collaboration were applied with both skill and principle. In this way, the story of Garvey's refuge at the Museum of Freedom and the survival of the remaining volunteers represents a pivotal transitional moment, bridging the period of collapse and disillusionment with the eventual resurgence of the Minutemen as a functioning force in the Commonwealth, demonstrating that while catastrophic events could nearly erase their presence, the combination of moral clarity, resilient leadership, and the intervention of willing allies could restore hope, fortify communities, and re-establish the Minutemen as both a practical defense network and a symbol of enduring human determination in a world still scarred by nuclear fire, setting the stage for the campaigns, rebuilding efforts, and philosophical reinforcement that would define the Minutemen in the decades to follow. The return of the Minutemen under the guidance of Preston Garvey, facilitated by the intervention and leadership of the sole survivor, represents one of the most significant periods of reconstruction and strategic resurgence in the history of the Commonwealth, a phase during which the organization transitioned from a shadow of its former self into a coherent, operational network capable of defending multiple settlements, reclaiming territory, and restoring a semblance of order across a landscape long dominated by chaos, scarcity, and lawlessness. In this period, the sole survivor, leveraging both pre-war experience and practical skills honed through personal survival in the Commonwealth, assumed a central role in the rebirth of the Minutemen, working in close coordination with Garvey to identify vulnerable settlements, assess their defensive needs, and mobilize volunteers, creating an effective framework in which each community's survival was enhanced not only by localized fortifications, but also by the assurance that aid could arrive from nearby Minutemen outposts, a networked approach that emphasized both rapid response and the ethical imperative to protect the most vulnerable inhabitants first. The process of rebuilding settlements involved both the restoration of physical infrastructure and the cultivation of civic resilience, including the construction of barricades, watchtowers, improvised fortifications, supply caches, and rudimentary but strategically placed artillery emplacements, while simultaneously implementing training programs for local volunteers in marksmanship, resource management, and defensive tactics, thereby ensuring that each settlement became a node in a larger, coordinated system of protection rather than a solitary, defenseless enclave, and these efforts were carefully prioritized to maximize coverage across the Commonwealth, while taking into account the limited manpower, equipment, and supplies available to the Minutemen at the time. The coordinated acts of protection, which formed the operational core of this rebirth, ranged from repelling raider attacks and neutralizing hostile mutant patrols to rescuing isolated civilians, escorting supply caravans, and reclaiming strategically important locations such as farms, water sources, and key trade routes, all of which reinforced the legitimacy of the Minutemen in the eyes of local populations and encouraged volunteer enlistment. creating a positive feedback loop that expanded both their reach and effectiveness. Central to this resurgence was the establishment of reliable communication channels, including messenger systems, signal beacons, and salvaged pre-war radio equipment, which allowed settlements to request reinforcements quickly, share intelligence on emerging threats, and coordinate patrol schedules, thereby overcoming the vulnerabilities exposed during the collapse following the Quincy massacre and ensuring that even geographically isolated communities were no longer left entirely on their own, while reinforcing a sense of solidarity and mutual accountability among volunteers and civilians alike. The ethical dimension of this revival was emphasized by Garvey and the sole survivor, who consistently framed the Minutemen's mission not as conquest or domination, but as the defense of life, property, and the social fabric of the Commonwealth, reinforcing the constitutional principles of volunteerism, moral responsibility, and decentralized leadership that had characterized the organization's founding, and ensuring that the rebirth did not repeat the mistakes of prior failures, where opportunism, miscommunication, or overextension had undermined trust and exposed settlements to catastrophic loss. Through these combined efforts, settlements were restored both physically and psychologically, with citizens regaining confidence in their ability to defend themselves and rely on a larger network of allies, and volunteers experienced a renewed sense of purpose, pride, and duty, strengthening the internal cohesion of the Minutemen while demonstrating to the broader Commonwealth that organized, principled collective action could restore security and stability in a landscape long dominated by danger and disorder. The strategic, operational, and moral successes of this period laid the foundation for future campaigns, reinforced the credibility of the Minutemen name, and solidified the role of Preston Garvey and the sole survivor as pivotal figures in the preservation and evolution of the Commonwealth Minutemen, proving that through coordinated leadership, ethical rigor, and the determined engagement of ordinary citizens, a fragmented, near-extinct organization could be reborn, reclaim lost ground, fortify vulnerable settlements, and once again become a symbol of protection, order, and hope for the people of the Commonwealth, demonstrating that even after near-total collapse, disciplined and principled action could restore both security and faith in the enduring ideals upon which the Minutemen had been founded. The restoration of the castle as the Minutemen's central headquarters marked a pivotal moment in the broader effort to rebuild the Commonwealth, both practically and symbolically, representing not merely the retaking of an ancestral fortress, but the re-establishment of an organizational identity that had been nearly extinguished in the chaos following the Quincy massacre and the subsequent disintegration of the network, and its reconstruction involved extensive labor, strategic planning, and the coordinated efforts of volunteers drawn from multiple settlements who recognized that the Minutemen's survival depended on a strong, defensible central hub capable of projecting both military capability and moral authority across the region. The castle, a pre-war military installation whose historical significance and preeminence in Concord provided a tangible connection to the revolutionary heritage that had inspired the Minutemen's founding, was transformed from a ruin into a functional bastion through the combined efforts of local civilians, scavenged materials, and improvised engineering, including reinforced walls, watchtowers, supply depots, and armories, while also incorporating communication arrays, training facilities, and secure accommodations for volunteers, creating a structure that was as much a symbol of civic revival as it was a practical center for operations, logistics, and governance. This consolidation of the castle not only served defensive purposes, but also acted as a rallying point for scattered settlements and volunteers, allowing the Minutemen to coordinate patrols, allocate resources efficiently, and respond rapidly to raider incursions, mutant threats, and other hazards, while simultaneously demonstrating to the Commonwealth at large that the Minutemen were a credible and enduring force, capable of restoring security and order in a landscape long dominated by lawlessness and uncertainty. The symbolic significance of the castle's reclamation cannot be overstated, as it represented the tangible embodiment of continuity between the early revolutionary ideals that had inspired the Minutemen and the modern principles of volunteerism, civic duty, and moral leadership that guided the rebuilt organization, providing a locus where both leadership and volunteers could converge, exchange intelligence, train new recruits, and plan operations that reinforced unity, legitimacy, and purpose across the network of settlements, thereby preventing the fragmentation and opportunistic exploitation that had characterized the period of collapse. In practical terms, the restored castle enabled the Minutemen to consolidate manpower and material resources, establishing a central repository for weapons, medical supplies, and rations, while also serving as a coordination point for strategic initiatives such as fortification of outlying settlements, the construction of patrol routes, and the development of early warning systems that leveraged both human scouts and salvaged communication technology, all of which enhanced the Minutemen's capacity to project stability across the Commonwealth. Culturally and psychologically, the castle became a symbol of hope, resilience, and legitimacy, a physical representation of the organization's rebirth and the enduring values of cooperation, courage, and ethical responsibility, and it served to inspire confidence in both volunteers and civilians, encouraging greater participation in the Minutemen network and reinforcing a collective identity rooted in protection, solidarity, and civic pride, bridging the gap between the organization's fractured past and its aspirational future. The consolidation of the castle as headquarters also facilitated strategic coordination with emerging allied factions, allowing the Minutemen to engage in joint operations, share intelligence, and negotiate cooperative agreements that strengthened their influence, while avoiding the pitfalls of overreach or authoritarian control, reflecting the organization's commitment to decentralized yet principled leadership, the equitable distribution of responsibility, and the prioritization of civilian welfare over territorial ambition. In essence, the rise of the castle as the Minutemen's restored headquarters signified the successful transition from reactive survivalism to proactive governance, fortification, and regional stabilization, marking the beginning of a new era in which the Minutemen could consolidate their vision, coordinate their efforts, and extend protection across the Commonwealth, demonstrating that even after near total collapse, the combination of principled leadership, cooperative action, and strategic planning could restore not only the physical infrastructure of the Minutemen, but also their moral authority, cultural cohesion, and enduring role as guardians of the people, ensuring that the organization could serve as both a practical force for defense and a symbolic embodiment of hope, unity, and resilience in the irradiated landscape of post-apocalyptic Massachusetts. The reborn Commonwealth Minutemen, emerging from the ashes of prior disasters and the guidance of Preston Garvey and the sole survivor, established a model of organized defense that distinguished them sharply from other post-apocalyptic factions, defining themselves as a true people's army, whose authority derived not from coercion, technological superiority, or the accumulation of power, but from voluntary cooperation, ethical leadership, and the shared commitment of ordinary citizens to protect their communities. Unlike the Brotherhood of Steel, whose focus on salvaging and controlling pre-war technology often subordinated civilian welfare to organizational ambition, or the Railroad, whose clandestine operations prioritized ideological goals over regional security, the Minutemen placed the immediate safety and stability of settlements at the center of their mission, ensuring that defensive operations, resource allocation, and strategic planning all served the practical and moral imperative of protecting civilians rather than expanding influence, extracting tribute, or consolidating political authority, and this commitment established the Minutemen as a uniquely legitimate and morally grounded force in the Commonwealth. Their voluntary structure meant that leadership positions, including the role of general, were not imposed by hierarchy, but earned through demonstrated courage, organizational skill, and adherence to the ethical principles embedded in the movement since its founding, creating a culture in which accountability, transparency, and communal consent govern decisions, operations, and recruitment, and fostering resilience against corruption, opportunism, or authoritarian tendencies that had previously plagued the organization during periods of collapse. Operationally, this ethos translated into a network of settlements mutually supporting one another through patrols, supply sharing, training programs, and rapid response to threats, creating an interconnected system in which the protection of life and community infrastructure was prioritized over territorial conquest, preemptive aggression, or political maneuvering, and in doing so, the Minutemen established an unprecedented standard for civic defense in the post-nuclear Commonwealth, demonstrating that disciplined coordination and ethical principles could coexist with practical survival strategies. The cultural identity of the Minutemen as a people's army was further reinforced by rituals, symbols, and practices that emphasized volunteerism, solidarity, and civic pride, such as the raising of the flag over the castle, community assemblies to resolve disputes, and the integration of local volunteers into broader operations, all of which cultivated trust, morale, and a sense of shared purpose that contrasted sharply with the secretive, hierarchical, or self-serving tendencies of rival factions. Ethically, the Minutemen codified norms of engagement designed to minimize harm to civilians, respect property, and uphold human dignity, reflecting a conscious effort to align tactical effectiveness with moral responsibility, ensuring that even in violent confrontations, their actions reinforced legitimacy, public confidence, and the underlying principles that justified their authority, while also discouraging opportunistic or predatory behavior among volunteers. Strategically, this people-centered approach allowed the Minutemen to gain broad-based support, recruit new volunteers from previously neutral or skeptical settlements, and create a reputation as a dependable, principled, and effective militia whose focus was on community resilience rather than conquest, thus differentiating the organization in both perception and practice from factions whose authority relied upon fear, secrecy, or technological dominance. The Minutemen's emphasis on voluntary cooperation and defense of civilians created a feedback loop in which communities invested in their own protection, trusted the network to provide reinforcement, and contributed manpower and resources to sustain operations, reinforcing both organizational stability and moral legitimacy, and demonstrating that a citizen-led military force, when grounded in shared principles and ethical oversight, could achieve effectiveness equal to or surpassing that of more authoritarian or technologically advanced factions, while maintaining accountability to the people they served. In this way, the Commonwealth Minutemen, as a people's army, embodied the foundational ideals of mutual aid, civic responsibility, and principled leadership, illustrating that post-apocalyptic survival need not come at the expense of morality or communal cohesion, and proving that even in a fractured, dangerous, and lawless world, ordinary citizens could collectively defend themselves, restore order, and preserve human dignity through voluntary, ethical, and cooperative action, establishing a template for enduring stability and resilience across the irradiated Commonwealth. The expansion of the Minutemen's influence under the leadership of Preston Garvey and the sole survivor marked a transformative era in the history of the Commonwealth, as the organization evolved from a scattered militia into a coordinated network capable of forging strategic alliances, consolidating regional defense, and projecting stability across previously vulnerable settlements, a process that relied on both pragmatic diplomacy and shared ideological commitment to civilian protection, mutual aid, and the restoration of civic order. In this period, the Minutemen actively sought to integrate independent settlements into a broader defensive coalition, providing fortifications, training, and logistical support, while simultaneously respecting the autonomy and governance of each community, fostering a sense of interdependence and shared purpose that strengthened morale, enhanced local resilience, and created the conditions for cooperative problem-solving and rapid response to threats such as raider incursions, mutant activity, and environmental hazards, thereby increasing both the practical and symbolic reach of the organization. Crucial to the effectiveness of this alliance building was the judicious engagement with other factions that controlled critical resources or technology, with the Minutemen demonstrating a willingness to cooperate with the railroad in matters of intelligence gathering, secure communication networks, and strategic operations, or with the Brotherhood of Steel, when technological expertise and access to pre-war armaments could be leveraged to fortify settlements, construct artillery emplacements, or develop defensive infrastructure, and in some cases these partnerships allowed for joint missions, shared training programs, and coordinated patrols, amplifying the defensive capacity of the alliance, while balancing the risks of dependence on factions whose priorities might not always perfectly align with the Minutemen's principles. The Great Commonwealth Alliance, as this cooperative network came to be known, functioned not merely as a tactical or military coalition, but as a mechanism for social, economic, and technological integration across the region, linking agricultural outposts, trading hubs, fortified towns, and isolated settlements into a mutually supportive system capable of withstanding both opportunistic raids and larger organized threats, while also allowing for the equitable distribution of supplies, personnel, and strategic intelligence in a manner that reflected the Minutemen's ethical commitment to voluntary cooperation rather than coercion or domination. The presence of the Minutemen within this alliance had a stabilizing effect on regional politics and security, as communities under their protection experienced fewer losses, more reliable access to resources, and improved coordination in defense planning, creating both a deterrent to hostile actors and a proof of concept for the efficacy of principled, citizen-led military organization, which in turn encouraged further voluntary enlistment, strengthened morale, and enhanced the legitimacy of Minutemen leadership. Technologically, The alliance allowed settlements to benefit from shared innovations, whether in energy generation, defensive armaments, or communication systems, and the selective partnerships with the Railroad or Brotherhood of Steel ensured that critical knowledge and tools could be incorporated into Minutemen operations without compromising the ethical framework of the organization, demonstrating that collaboration could be pursued pragmatically without undermining the values of civilian protection, decentralized governance, and moral accountability. The long-term impact of the Great Commonwealth Alliance was the creation of a coherent and resilient regional network, capable of projecting security and stability over a significant portion of the Commonwealth, reducing the vulnerability of isolated settlements, suppressing opportunistic raids, and providing a foundation for sustained civic and economic activity in a world still recovering from the devastation of nuclear war. And in doing so, the Minutemen not only fulfilled their original mandate as defenders of the people, but also established themselves as a central organizing force whose influence, credibility, and ethical authority shaped the post-apocalyptic political landscape, proving that even in the harsh and fractured environment of the Commonwealth, principled cooperation, strategic alliances, and the disciplined application of volunteer military power could create enduring stability, enhanced security, and a shared vision for recovery, reinforcing the notion that the Minutemen were no longer a relic of past ideals, but a living, adaptive, and morally grounded institution capable of leading the reconstruction of a civilization emerging from the ashes. Looking forward, the sustainability and enduring relevance of the Commonwealth Minutemen hinges upon a delicate balance between organizational cohesion, adherence to foundational ethical principles, and the capacity to adapt to the evolving social, political, and technological landscape of post-war Massachusetts. As the organization faces potential schisms, ideological debates, and external pressures that could either strengthen or fracture its influence, historical patterns suggest that periods of expansion and alliance, such as those forged under Preston Garvey and the sole survivor, increase operational effectiveness and legitimacy, yet simultaneously introduce the risk of internal tension as diverse settlements and volunteers bring differing priorities, expectations, and interpretations of Minutemen doctrine, creating fertile ground for disputes over resource allocation, strategic decisions, and leadership succession, which, if unresolved, could lead to splinter groups or local factions asserting autonomy in ways that challenge the networked authority of the general. Ideological purity remains a central concern for the long-term survival of the Minutemen, as the organization's credibility and moral authority are rooted in its unwavering commitment to civilian protection, voluntary cooperation, and principled leadership, and any compromise of these values, whether through opportunistic behavior, coercion, or alignment with morally ambiguous factions, risks eroding both internal cohesion and public trust, thereby undermining the social contract that sustains the militia's legitimacy across the Commonwealth. Post-Institute society introduces additional complexities, as the potential resurgence or remnants of technologically advanced organizations like the Institute, combined with the decentralized power of settlements, the ambitions of rival factions such as the Brotherhood of Steel, the Railroad, or regional raider networks, and the unpredictable behavior of mutant and synth threats, requires the Minutemen to remain both adaptable and principled, capable of negotiating alliances, defending territory, and integrating technological resources without compromising the ethical core of their mission. Sustainability also depends upon the cultivation of civic culture within Allied settlements, training new volunteers, and reinforcing the perception of the Minutemen as a morally grounded, reliable, and non-coercive force, since the long-term cohesion of the organization relies not solely on military capacity but on the willing participation and trust of the civilian population, ensuring that authority is exercised through legitimacy rather than fear, that coordination is maintained without authoritarian overreach, and that the protective mandate remains central to all operations. Projecting into the future, one can speculate that the Minutemen will continue to function as both a stabilizing military network and a moral exemplar, bridging the gap between decentralized settlements and the broader Commonwealth, with the potential for localized governance disputes, generational shifts in volunteer priorities, and ethical debates over engagement with other factions, shaping the evolution of policy, tactics, and leadership structure. Yet the foundational ethos of mutual defense, principled leadership, and voluntary cooperation provides a resilient framework capable of mitigating many of these risks, allowing the organization to endure in fluctuating circumstances while retaining a reputation as a bastion of civic responsibility. Additionally, the Minutemen's historical experience, from the founding in Concord to the post-Quincy collapse and subsequent revival under Garvey and the sole survivor, offers a repository of lessons in crisis management, moral leadership, and organizational adaptation that can guide future leaders in balancing expansion, collaboration, and ideological fidelity, ensuring that the organization remains capable of responding effectively to both immediate threats and long-term societal evolution. Ultimately, the Minutemen's role in the post-Institute Commonwealth is likely to be that of a stabilizing intermediary, protecting vulnerable settlements, facilitating cooperation among diverse factions, and serving as a moral counterweight to potentially coercive or technologically dominant powers, thereby preserving the principles of civic protection, community autonomy, and ethical military conduct. And while future schisms or ideological debates may test the organization's cohesion, the combination of historical precedent, principled leadership, and broad popular support suggests that the Minutemen are uniquely positioned to endure as a sustainable, adaptive, and morally credible force, ensuring that the legacy of the People's Army continues to influence the social, political, and defensive landscape of the Commonwealth long into the uncertain decades following the events chronicled in the early 23rd century. The legacy of the Commonwealth Minutemen, tracing its lineage from the revolutionary-inspired founding in Concord through the devastating trials of the Quincy massacre, the organizational collapse that followed, and the eventual revival under Preston Garvey and the sole survivor, represents a profound illustration of humanity's capacity for resilience, unity, and hope in the aftermath of unparalleled catastrophe, as their story embodies not only tactical and logistical achievements, but also enduring philosophical and ethical lessons about the nature of civilization, the moral responsibilities of leadership, and the power of collective action in a fractured world, demonstrating that even amid the most extreme adversity, ordinary individuals, when bound together by shared principles of mutual aid, voluntary cooperation, and the protection of the vulnerable, can restore social cohesion, safeguard communities, and create functional systems capable of sustaining life, dignity, and culture across a devastated landscape. Their historical trajectory, marked by near extinction, the disintegration of early networks, and the isolation of key leaders, highlights the fragility of societal structures when faced with systemic shocks, including the collapse of communication, opportunistic exploitation by false leaders, and the threat of hostile factions, yet simultaneously underscores the remarkable capacity for human agency, as figures such as Garvey and the sole survivor demonstrated that moral clarity, principled leadership, and disciplined organization could reclaim authority, restore trust, and coordinate a wide-reaching defense network across settlements, fortifying both physical and symbolic centers, such as the castle, establishing communication and intelligence networks, and ensuring that even geographically isolated or marginalized communities could benefit from protection, resources, and guidance. The Minutemen's evolution into a people's army further exemplifies the capacity of humanity to construct systems of governance and defense that are ethically grounded, decentralized yet coordinated, and capable of mobilizing volunteers through consensus, respect, and shared commitment rather than coercion, fear, or the pursuit of political dominance, differentiating the organization from factions like the Brotherhood of Steel, whose emphasis on technology control often marginalized civilian interests, or the Railroad, whose secretive operations prioritized ideological goals over regional security, and in doing so, the Minutemen established a model for civic-military synergy, in which the moral and practical imperatives of protecting life and fostering community cohesion are inseparable from operational efficiency. Culturally, psychologically, and symbolically, the Minutemen have come to represent an aspirational ideal, embodying the notion that ordinary people, when united by purpose and guided by ethical principles, can achieve stability, defense, and moral authority in the midst of chaos, reinforcing the idea that the legitimacy of a protective organization stems not from technological superiority, hierarchical dominance, or coercive power, but from the trust, participation, and investment of the communities it serves, and that even in an irradiated, post-apocalyptic environment, the active engagement of volunteers in training, patrols, settlement fortification, and emergency response constitutes a living affirmation of civic responsibility, resilience, and self-reliance. Their historical record, from early victories to catastrophic setbacks and ultimate resurgence, provides a rich tapestry for understanding how humans adapt to crises, negotiate ethical dilemmas, and construct functional societal structures under extreme duress, illustrating both the vulnerabilities of decentralized defense networks and the strategies through which they can survive, evolve, and thrive, including the strategic consolidation of strongholds, the careful cultivation of alliances with allied factions, selective technological cooperation, and the embedding of moral and operational codes into everyday practices, ensuring that future generations of Minutemen remain guided by precedent as well as principle. The story of the Minutemen also resonates as a reflection on memory, symbolism, and the role of narrative in sustaining human societies. As events such as the Quincy massacre, the refuge at the Museum of Freedom, and the rise of the castle function not merely as tactical milestones, but as moral and cultural touchstones, shaping identity, reinforcing communal norms, and transmitting lessons of courage, sacrifice, and ethical duty to volunteers and civilians alike, thereby ensuring that the ethos of the People's Army endures beyond individual lifetimes and immediate military considerations, while simultaneously inspiring hope that reconstruction and cooperation are possible even in a fractured, dangerous, and morally ambiguous environment. In examining their broader significance, the Minutemen stand as a counterpoint to despair and nihilism in the post-apocalyptic Commonwealth, demonstrating that the reconstruction of society is not a passive process, but an active endeavor dependent upon human initiative, ethical governance, coordinated defense, and the integration of dispersed communities into a network that balances autonomy with mutual responsibility, and that the endurance of civilization rests as much on the cultivation of trust, solidarity, and moral accountability as it does on walls, weapons, or technology. Ultimately, the legacy of the People's Guardians is a testament to the enduring human capacity to rise from devastation, reclaim agency, and rebuild civilization from ruins, offering a narrative in which cooperation, courage, and moral vision are not abstract ideals, but lived practices capable of transforming vulnerability into resilience, fear into courage, and chaos into order. And their story serves as a reminder that in any society, even one scarred by nuclear fire, the act of coming together, defending one another, and asserting the ethical imperative to protect life constitutes the most profound expression of hope and humanity, leaving a lasting blueprint for generations to follow, and ensuring that the Minutemen's influence, both tangible and symbolic, continues to inspire, guide, and safeguard the people of the Commonwealth, demonstrating that even amid destruction, the collective effort of principled individuals can rebuild not only infrastructure, but also the moral and social fabric of civilization itself.